The Iran-Israel conflict is one of the most complex and volatile geopolitical struggles in the Middle East, with deep historical roots and profound implications for global security. In this detailed video, we explore the origins of the conflict, from the 1979 Iranian Revolution to modern-day tensions, proxy wars, and nuclear ambitions. Discover how Iran's revolutionary ideology, Israel's security concerns, and the involvement of regional and global powers like the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia have turned this into a multi-layered conflict. We also dive into the key flashpoints, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Syrian Civil War, as well as the shadow war of cyberattacks and covert operations. This video examines potential outcomes, from nuclear threats to diplomatic resolutions, like the Iran nuclear deal, also known as the JCPOA, while considering the role of global powers in shaping the conflict's future. Join us as we analyze the human cost of this ongoing confrontation and explore possible paths forward for peace and stability in the Middle East. Watch now to gain a comprehensive understanding of the Iran-Israel conflict and the broader implications for the region and the world. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more in-depth geopolitical analysis. Let's start today's topic. The Iran-Israel conflict, a complex, multifaceted struggle. The conflict between Iran and Israel is one of the most intricate and potentially explosive in the Middle East. It is a confrontation shaped by deep historical roots, religious differences, geopolitical rivalries, and divergent visions for the region's future. This conflict has evolved into a proxy war of ideologies and territorial power that threatens regional and global stability. To understand its complexities, we must analyze its history, major players, ideological foundations, and potential outcomes. A history of animosity, from revolution to proxy wars. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 drastically altered the Middle Eastern political landscape. Before this, Iran, under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had maintained relatively positive relations with Israel. The Shah saw Israel as a strategic ally in a volatile region and shared concerns over Arab nationalism, which both countries viewed as a threat. Additionally, the Shah's close alignment with the United States, Israel's most important ally, helped foster a working relationship between Tehran and Tel Aviv. However, this relationship changed dramatically when the Shah was overthrown and the Islamic Republic was established under Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini's revolution espoused a radical ideology that rejected the West and its allies. At the forefront of this anti-Western stance was a staunch anti-Israel position. Khomeini and his followers viewed Israel as a Zionist entity that embodied Western imperialism in the heart of the Islamic world. Israel, which had previously maintained covert and semi-official ties with Iran, found itself facing a newly empowered regime hostile to its very existence. The enmity between the two countries intensified throughout the 1980s when Iran began supporting militant groups that were engaged in hostilities with Israel. One of the most significant developments was Iran's backing of Hezbollah, a Shia Islamist militant group based in Lebanon. Founded in the early 1980s with substantial support from Iran's Revolutionary Guard, Hezbollah became one of Israel's most formidable enemies in the region. Hezbollah was born in the context of the Lebanese Civil War and the 1982 Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon, which was intended to expel Palestinian militants. Hezbollah's objective, funded and armed by Tehran, was not just to resist Israel's occupation, but also to promote Iran's revolutionary ideology. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Hezbollah engaged in numerous guerrilla operations, suicide bombings, and rocket attacks against Israeli forces, making Lebanon a key battleground in the wider Iran-Israel conflict. Israel's deep involvement in Lebanon, including its extended military presence, gave Iran the perfect proxy through which to challenge Israel. In this way, the conflict between Iran and Israel was not fought on Israeli or Iranian soil, but through proxy forces and asymmetric warfare tactics. The nuclear dimension, a game changer. The conflict between Iran and Israel took on a new, more dangerous dimension in the early 2000s, with the discovery of Iran's clandestine nuclear activities. These revelations triggered alarm in Israel, as a nuclear-capable Iran was viewed as an existential threat to its very survival. Iran insisted that its nuclear program was for peaceful purposes, but Israel and much of the international community remained unconvinced. The nuclear issue highlights a critical component of the strategic calculus in the Iran-Israel conflict: Israel's long-standing policy of nuclear ambiguity. While Israel has never officially acknowledged possessing nuclear weapons, it is widely believed to have developed them as early as the 1960s. The assumption that Israel has a nuclear arsenal provides it with a powerful deterrent against existential threats, and this deterrence is often referred to as Israel's Samson option, named after the biblical figure who destroyed his enemies even at the cost of his own life. From Israel's perspective, a nuclear-armed Iran would dramatically shift the balance of power in the Middle East. Israel, geographically small and surrounded by hostile actors, believes it cannot afford to tolerate a nuclear Iran, which has repeatedly called for its destruction. Iran, on the other hand, insists that Israel's possession of nuclear weapons is itself a destabilizing factor in the region, leading to a cycle of suspicion, fear, and mutual distrust. In 2015, international negotiations culminated in the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, between Iran and the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. This nuclear deal limited Iran's nuclear capabilities in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions. The deal was hailed as a diplomatic victory by many, but was fiercely opposed by Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was one of the most vocal critics, arguing that the agreement did not go far enough to dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure and merely delayed Iran's path to nuclear weapons. The withdrawal of the United States from the JCPOA in 2018 under President Donald Trump reignited tensions. Sanctions were reimposed on Iran, leading Tehran to resume aspects of its nuclear program. Israel has repeatedly stated that it will not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons, even if that requires military intervention. This stance continues to raise the specter of a potential Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, with unpredictable and potentially catastrophic consequences. The Syrian Civil War, a proxy battlefield. Iran's involvement in Syria. The Syrian Civil War, which began in 2011, has provided yet another arena for the Iran-Israel conflict to unfold. Iran has played a critical role in supporting the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, sending military advisors, weapons, and funding. Iran views Syria as a vital ally in the so-called axis of resistance, which includes Hezbollah and, to a lesser extent, Palestinian militant groups. Maintaining influence in Syria allows Iran to project power across the Levant and sustain a logistical supply line to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Israel's response: airstrikes and red lines. Israel, for its part, has been deeply concerned about Iran's growing military presence in Syria. Iranian forces, along with Hezbollah fighters, have established a foothold near Israel's northern border, which Israel perceives as an intolerable threat. To counter Iran's entrenchment in Syria, Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes on Iranian and Hezbollah targets within Syria, aiming to degrade Iran's ability to transfer weapons to Hezbollah and build military infrastructure near Israeli territory. While these Israeli airstrikes have largely succeeded in limiting Iran's influence in Syria, they have also heightened the risk of a broader confrontation. The situation in Syria has thus become a dangerous flashpoint in the Iran-Israel conflict, where the possibility of a direct military clash between the two countries has grown increasingly likely. The Shadow War. Cyberattacks and covert operations. Beyond conventional military engagement, Iran and Israel have been locked in a shadow war characterized by covert operations, assassinations, and cyberattacks. This clandestine struggle has escalated over the years and reflects the broader ideological, military, and technological rivalry between the two nations. Cyber warfare, a new frontline. One of the most significant aspects of this shadow war is cyber warfare. Both countries have been accused of carrying out sophisticated cyber attacks on each other's critical infrastructure. One of the most high-profile incidents was the Stuxnet virus, which was reportedly developed by the US and Israel to sabotage Iran's nuclear centrifuges in 2010. The virus caused significant damage to Iran's nuclear program, delaying its progress and demonstrating the effectiveness of cyber tools in modern conflicts. In response, Iran has also engaged in cyber attacks against Israel. There have been several instances of cyber intrusions into Israeli water systems, financial institutions, and defense systems, though Israel has largely managed to fend off these attacks. Covert assassinations, the targeting of nuclear scientists. Another dimension of the shadow war is the assassination of key figures involved in Iran's nuclear program. Israel has been accused of being behind the killing of several high-profile Iranian nuclear scientists, most notably Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in 2020, who was seen as the mastermind behind Iran's nuclear weapons program. Such targeted killings, though never officially acknowledged by Israel, have been attributed to its intelligence agency, the Mossad, and serve as a reminder of the lengths to which Israel is willing to go to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. Iran, in turn, has sought to retaliate through its own covert operations. Iranian-linked groups have been implicated in attacks against Israeli diplomats and tourists abroad, particularly in places like Thailand and India. These incidents underline the global reach of the Iran-Israel conflict and the risk of escalating tensions far beyond the Middle East. Key players, a web of alliances and rivalries. Iran's allies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Syria. The Iran-Israel conflict is not fought solely by the two principal actors. Rather, it is intertwined with a broader web of regional alliances. Iran's primary allies include Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Assad regime in Syria. Each of these actors plays a critical role in Iran's strategy to confront Israel. Hezbollah, often described as Iran's strategic arm in the region, is perhaps the most capable non-state military force in the Middle East, possessing tens of thousands of rockets aimed at Israel. Hezbollah's involvement in the Syrian Civil War alongside Iranian forces has further solidified the relationship between Tehran and the group, positioning Hezbollah as a key player in any future conflict with Israel. Hamas, a Palestinian Islamist movement, also receives support from Iran, although its relations with Tehran have been strained at times due to ideological differences and Hamas's involvement in the Sunni-majority Palestinian cause. Nevertheless, Iran provides Hamas with funding, training, and weapons support, viewing it as a vital part of its broader strategy to challenge Israeli dominance. Hamas, based in Gaza, engages in periodic rocket attacks against Israeli civilian targets, further heightening tensions between Iran and Israel. The group's reliance on Iranian military aid allows Tehran to maintain pressure on Israel's southern front, while Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, operates along Israel's northern border. This two-front strategy creates a persistent threat for Israel, even when direct confrontations with Iran itself are avoided. Iran's broader influence, the axis of resistance. Iran positions itself as the leader of the axis of resistance against Israel and Western influence in the Middle East. This axis includes Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Assad regime in Syria, as well as various Shia militia groups operating in Iraq and Yemen. Iran's goal is to encircle Israel with hostile forces, using its alliances to deter Israeli actions and project its influence throughout the region. In Syria, for instance, Iran has helped solidify Assad's grip on power, allowing it to establish a permanent military presence close to Israel's Golan Heights. In Iraq, Iranian-backed militias have become a significant political and military force following the defeat of ISIS, further expanding Iran's influence westward. In Yemen, Iranian support for the Houthi rebels has contributed to the country's devastating civil war and created another potential flashpoint for Israeli-Iranian competition, as the Houthis have occasionally threatened Israel with missile strikes. Israel's strategic partnerships, the US and Gulf states. On the other side, Israel's most important ally is the United States, which has provided Israel with substantial military, financial, and diplomatic support since the Jewish state's founding in 1948. US assistance has been crucial to maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge over its adversaries, particularly in the fields of air defense, intelligence, and missile technology. In addition to the US, Israel has increasingly found common cause with several Gulf Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, or UAE. While historically at odds, Israel and these Sunni-majority countries now share a mutual interest in countering Iranian influence. The 2020 Abraham Accords, brokered by the Trump administration, normalized diplomatic relations between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, representing a significant shift in Middle Eastern geopolitics. While these accords were not explicitly about Iran, they underscore a growing Arab-Israeli alignment against Tehran. Saudi Arabia, although not formally part of the accords, has similarly warmed to Israel, driven by shared concerns over Iran's growing power. Both Israel and Saudi Arabia view Iran's ballistic missile program, nuclear ambitions, and regional interventions as existential threats. Although Riyadh has not yet normalized relations with Israel, intelligence cooperation and informal diplomatic exchanges have increased in recent years. The convergence of Israeli and Gulf Arab interests against Iran highlights the shifting alliances in the Middle East. As Iran seeks to expand its influence through Shia militias and proxies, Israel and its new Arab partners are exploring avenues of cooperation to counterbalance Tehran's regional ambitions. Potential consequences of further escalation. A region on the brink. The Iran-Israel conflict has the potential to escalate into a full-scale war that could destabilize not only the Middle East, but also the broader international community. Several key factors contribute to this risk: military escalation and direct conflict. The most immediate concern is the possibility of direct military confrontation between Iran and Israel. While both nations have avoided full-scale war up to this point, the frequent airstrikes, cyberattacks, and covert operations create an environment where miscalculation is always a danger. If one of these incidents escalates, it could lead to a broader conflict that draws in regional powers and global actors such as the United States and Russia. For example, Iran's entrenchment in Syria and Israel's airstrikes on Iranian military installations have led to several close calls. The downing of a Russian aircraft over Syria in 2018 by Syrian air defenses, mistakenly fired in response to an Israeli strike, illustrated the dangers of these entanglements. A more serious incident could spark a broader military confrontation. Proxy wars spilling over. Another major concern is that the proxy wars Iran and Israel are involved in, particularly in Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria, could escalate into a regional war. Hezbollah, with its vast arsenal of rockets and missiles, represents a significant threat to Israel. A full-scale conflict between Israel and Hezbollah would likely draw in Iran and could spill over into Syria and Iraq. Such a war would cause massive destruction, displace millions of civilians, and create further instability across the Middle East. In Gaza, the periodic flare-ups between Hamas and Israel also have the potential to escalate, especially if Iran increases its support for Hamas or if Israel decides to launch a major ground invasion in response to rocket attacks. Iran's influence in Iraq, where pro-Iranian militias operate with significant autonomy, adds yet another layer of complexity. These militias could potentially be drawn into a broader conflict with Israel, especially if Iran seeks to use them as part of its strategy to exert pressure on multiple fronts. Economic consequences, energy and global markets. The economic consequences of a wider Iran-Israel conflict would be catastrophic, particularly for global energy markets. Iran controls access to the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes. In the event of a military confrontation, Iran could attempt to close the strait or disrupt shipping lanes, leading to a spike in global oil prices and potentially causing severe economic disruptions worldwide. Moreover, The broader instability that would result from a regional war could lead to long-term damage to the economies of Middle Eastern countries. Infrastructure destruction, refugee crises, and prolonged military engagement would strain the region's resources, leading to further impoverishment and political instability. Involvement of global powers. The Iran-Israel conflict also has the potential to draw in global powers, particularly the United States and Russia. The US has long been a staunch supporter of Israel and has pledged to help defend it in the event of an existential threat. This commitment could pull Washington into a broader military conflict, especially if Israel were to launch a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, prompting Iranian retaliation. Russia, meanwhile, has close ties with Iran and has been a key ally of the Assad regime in Syria. Moscow would likely try to prevent the complete collapse of its Syrian ally and could become involved if Israeli strikes against Iranian targets threaten to destabilize Syria further. This dynamic introduces the risk of a US-Russian confrontation, raising the stakes of the conflict to an unprecedented level. The path forward: de-escalation and diplomatic solutions. While the trajectory of the Iran-Israel conflict appears to be heading toward greater hostility, there are still potential avenues for de-escalation and diplomacy. These efforts must address the broader geopolitical dynamics at play, as well as the specific security concerns of both Iran and Israel. Reviving the Iran nuclear deal, or JCPOA. One of the most immediate steps that could help reduce tensions is the revival of the Iran nuclear deal. The Biden administration has expressed interest in returning to the JCPOA, provided that Iran comes back into full compliance with its nuclear commitments. A re-entry into the deal would place limits on Iran's nuclear program, reducing the immediate threat of a nuclear-armed Iran, which is one of Israel's primary security concerns. Reinstating the JCPOA could also lead to a broader diplomatic framework for addressing other contentious issues, such as Iran's ballistic missile program and its support for proxy groups in Lebanon and Gaza. While the nuclear deal alone will not resolve the conflict, it could provide a foundation for further negotiations. Confidence-building measures and dialogue. Given the deep distrust between Iran and Israel, direct negotiations are unlikely in the near future. However, back-channel communication and confidence-building measures could help prevent misunderstandings and miscalculations. For example, both countries could agree on red lines to avoid direct confrontations in Syria, or they could establish mechanisms to de-escalate tensions in the event of accidental clashes. Track 2 diplomacy, involving non-governmental actors, civil society, and think tanks, could also play a role in facilitating dialogue. These informal channels can help keep communication open and explore creative solutions to the conflict without the political pressures that formal negotiations often entail. Addressing the regional dimension. To achieve lasting peace, the international community must address the broader regional conflicts that fuel the Iran-Israel rivalry. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Syrian Civil War, and the broader Sunni-Shia divide all contribute to the tensions between Tehran and Tel Aviv. Resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in particular, would undermine Iran's ability to use the Palestinian cause as a justification for its hostility toward Israel. While a two-state solution remains elusive, renewed efforts to achieve peace between Israelis and Palestinians could have a ripple effect, helping to stabilize the region and reduce Iran's influence over groups like Hamas. Similarly, a political resolution to the Syrian Civil War that balances the interests of the various regional actors, including Iran, Turkey, and Russia, could help reduce the intensity of the conflict and prevent Syria from being used as a battleground between Iran and Israel. Upholding international law and human rights. Both Iran and Israel, along with their respective proxies, have been accused of violating international law and committing human rights abuses during their long-standing conflict. The international community must insist on accountability for these actions, particularly when they involve the targeting of civilians. International bodies, including the United Nations, must continue to monitor the situation and apply pressure on all parties to uphold international humanitarian law. A commitment to protecting civilians and avoiding unnecessary destruction will be crucial in preventing the conflict from spiraling out of control. Beyond the headlines, the human cost of conflict. While the Iran-Israel conflict is often framed in geopolitical and military terms, the human cost of the ongoing struggle cannot be overlooked. Both Israeli and Iranian civilians live under constant fear of escalation, while the populations in conflict zones like Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria bear the brunt of the violence. The impact on ordinary people across the region underscores the urgent need for a resolution that considers not just the strategic interests of governments, but also the well-being of the millions of civilians affected by this protracted conflict. In Iran, the consequences of the conflict with Israel, along with Iran's broader confrontations with the West, have resulted in a severe toll on its population. Economic sanctions, particularly those reimposed after the United States' withdrawal from the JCPOA, have devastated Iran's economy. The Iranian rial has lost much of its value, inflation has skyrocketed, and essential goods, including medicine, have become scarce. While these sanctions were designed to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions, their effects have disproportionately harmed ordinary citizens. The Iranian government has attempted to maintain public support by framing its opposition to Israel as a matter of national and religious pride, positioning itself as a defender of the Palestinian cause and Islamic values. However, there is growing dissatisfaction within Iran, as many citizens feel that the government's foreign policy priorities, including its support for groups like Hezbollah and its intervention in Syria, have come at the expense of addressing domestic, economic, and social issues. Protests against government corruption and economic mismanagement have become more frequent in recent years, with some Iranians calling for an end to the country's costly involvement in regional conflicts. The conflict has also deepened the divide between Iran's conservative leadership and its more progressive, reform-minded citizens, many of whom seek greater engagement with the world and a focus on domestic development rather than regional confrontations. This internal struggle over the country's future direction further complicates Tehran's ability to navigate its rivalry with Israel. In Israel, the conflict with Iran has shaped much of the country's national security policies and public psyche. The constant threat of rocket attacks from Hezbollah in the north and Hamas in the south has created an environment of fear and insecurity. Israel's government has invested heavily in its military, including the development of advanced missile defense systems like the Iron Dome, David's Sling, and the Arrow program, which provide some level of protection from incoming threats. However, even with these technologies, the psychological impact on the Israeli population is significant, as civilians must always be prepared for the possibility of a sudden attack. The conflict has also contributed to a growing militarization of Israeli society, where national security concerns dominate political discourse and shape electoral outcomes. Israeli leaders, especially those from right-leaning parties, often invoke the existential threat posed by Iran to justify military actions and hardline policies. This dynamic has created a political environment where calls for diplomacy or compromise are often viewed with suspicion, and hawkish policies tend to prevail. Furthermore, Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories and its frequent military actions in Gaza are intertwined with its broader conflict with Iran. Iran's support for Palestinian militant groups like Hamas allows Tehran to maintain pressure on Israel, while Israeli airstrikes and military campaigns in Gaza are framed as necessary to weaken Iran's influence in the region. This cycle of violence perpetuates the broader Israel-Iran rivalry, leaving both sides in a constant state of readiness for war. The proxy wars between Iran and Israel have exacerbated humanitarian crises in Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria. In Lebanon, Hezbollah's dominance in the country's political and military affairs has drawn the country deeper into Iran's orbit, making it a target for Israeli military actions. Israel's periodic conflicts with Hezbollah, such as the 2006 Lebanon War, have resulted in widespread destruction and displacement. Lebanon's fragile economy, already on the brink of collapse, has been further weakened by the ongoing tensions, leaving many Lebanese citizens in dire economic straits. Gaza, too, remains a flashpoint. The Israeli blockade of Gaza, combined with repeated military operations against Hamas and other militant groups, has created a severe humanitarian crisis. Gaza's infrastructure is in ruins, and its population suffers from high levels of poverty, unemployment, and food insecurity. Iran's support for Hamas ensures that the cycle of violence between Gaza and Israel continues, as Israeli airstrikes and ground incursions provoke retaliatory rocket attacks and vice versa. Civilians in Gaza bear the overwhelming burden of this conflict, with little hope for an end to the blockade or a resolution to the ongoing violence. Syria, where Iran and Israel's proxy war has been most visible in recent years, is facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. The civil war has devastated the country, displacing millions and killing hundreds of thousands. Iran's military support for the Assad regime, combined with Israeli airstrikes targeting Iranian positions, has further prolonged the conflict. Civilians in Syria continue to suffer, caught between the Assad regime's brutal repression, the destruction caused by foreign interventions, and the ongoing battle for regional dominance. The future of the Iran-Israel conflict: uncertainties and challenges. The future of the Iran-Israel conflict is deeply uncertain. Both sides appear entrenched in their positions, unwilling to make significant compromises or de-escalate their military postures. Several factors make the path forward challenging. Entrenchment of ideologies. At the heart of the Iran-Israel conflict is a deep-seated ideological divide. Iran's leaders, particularly those in the Revolutionary Guard and the clerical establishment, view Israel as an illegitimate entity that must be opposed as part of their broader anti-Western and anti-imperialist stance. This ideological commitment to Israel's destruction is reinforced by Iran's revolutionary identity and its desire to be seen as a defender of oppressed Muslims, particularly the Palestinians. In Israel, the memory of the Holocaust and the constant threat of annihilation create a siege mentality that makes compromise difficult. Many Israelis view Iran's nuclear ambitions and support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas as existential threats that justify aggressive military actions and a firm stance against Tehran's influence. This mutual mistrust and fear of annihilation have entrenched both sides in their ideological positions, making meaningful dialogue and compromise seem remote. The risk of miscalculation. One of the greatest risks in the ongoing conflict is the possibility of miscalculation. Both Iran and Israel have engaged in aggressive military actions, including cyberattacks, airstrikes, and assassinations. While these actions have thus far avoided sparking a full-scale war, the risk of an accidental escalation is always present. A misstep, such as an Israeli strike that kills Iranian personnel in Syria or a successful Iranian cyber attack on Israeli infrastructure, could quickly spiral into a broader confrontation, particularly if either side feels compelled to respond to preserve its deterrence credibility. The involvement of other actors, such as Hezbollah and Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria, adds further unpredictability. These groups operate with a degree of autonomy and could provoke a conflict that drags their patrons into a broader war. Regional and global power struggles. The Iran-Israel conflict is also shaped by broader regional and global power struggles. Iran's rivalry with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, its relationships with Russia and China, and Israel's alliances with the United States and the newly normalized ties with Gulf Arab states all contribute to the complexity of the conflict. These alliances and rivalries make any resolution to the conflict difficult, as regional powers use the Iran-Israel rivalry to further their own strategic goals. Globally, the involvement of the United States and Russia in the region adds another layer of complexity. The United States has consistently supported Israel both militarily and diplomatically, while Russia's close ties with Iran, particularly in Syria, make it a key player in any potential resolution to the conflict. However, these global powers also have competing interests, which can complicate efforts to de-escalate tensions between Iran and Israel. A call for peace hope amidst the turmoil. Despite the many challenges and uncertainties, there are still reasons to hope for a peaceful resolution to the Iran-Israel conflict. Both sides have constituencies that yearn for peace and security, and there are diplomatic avenues that could be explored to reduce tensions and prevent further escalation. Encouraging civil society engagement. One of the most promising avenues for promoting peace is the encouragement of civil society engagement between Iranians and Israelis. While political leaders may be entrenched in their positions, there are many ordinary citizens in both countries who desire peace and dialogue. People-to-people exchanges, cultural collaborations, and grassroots peace initiatives can help build bridges of understanding between the two societies, even when official diplomatic channels are closed. Technology and social media can play a role in facilitating these interactions, allowing Israelis and Iranians to communicate directly and challenge the narratives of hate and mistrust that have dominated their political discourse for decades. Such initiatives can help foster empathy and mutual understanding, laying the groundwork for future reconciliation. Diplomacy and international mediation. While direct negotiations between Iran and Israel may be unlikely in the near term, the international community can play a critical role in mediating the conflict. The revival of the JCPOA, with additional provisions addressing regional security concerns, could provide a framework for reducing tensions. International actors, such as the European Union, Russia and China, as well as regional powers like Turkey and Qatar, could also facilitate dialogue between Tehran and Tel Aviv, even if such talks initially focus on confidence-building measures rather than comprehensive peace agreements. Addressing the root causes of conflict. To achieve a lasting peace, the international community must also address the root causes of the Iran-Israel conflict, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian issue and the broader Sunni-Shia divide in the region. Resolving these underlying conflicts would help create a more stable and secure environment in the Middle East, reducing the incentives for Iran and Israel to continue their rivalry. Efforts to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including renewed negotiations for a two-state solution, would undermine Iran's ability to use the Palestinian cause as a rallying point for its anti-Israel rhetoric. Similarly, political solutions to the Syrian Civil War and other regional conflicts could reduce the platforms that Iran uses to project power and influence against Israel. Addressing sectarian tensions between Sunni and Shia populations across the Middle East would also mitigate the broader power struggles that fuel proxy wars and instability. Conclusion: the long road to peace. The Iran-Israel conflict remains one of the most complex and dangerous disputes in the modern world. It is a struggle rooted in history, ideology, and power, with both nations viewing the other as a significant threat to their survival. The layers of proxy wars, regional alliances, nuclear ambitions, and ideological fervor make resolving the conflict incredibly difficult. Yet, despite the many challenges, a path to peace is not entirely out of reach. The revival of diplomacy, particularly through the Iran nuclear deal, confidence-building measures, and efforts to resolve broader regional disputes, could lay the groundwork for reducing tensions. Furthermore, fostering dialogue between civil societies in both nations can help humanize the conflict, allowing ordinary citizens to build bridges where political leaders have failed. Ultimately, resolving the Iran-Israel conflict will require both sides to make difficult compromises and recognize the security needs and humanity of the other. The international community, too, must commit to mediating in good faith, addressing the root causes of regional instability, and upholding international law. While the road to peace is long and fraught with obstacles, it remains the only viable solution to prevent a catastrophic escalation and ensure a more peaceful and stable Middle East.